What's up, guys? Dylon here, and today I'm going to talk about 10 factors that are hindering or need to be overcome for Bitcoin to get institutional adoption. And I think these will be overcome in the next cycle. But let's get into the video. Like, comment, share, subscribe, and let's go. So, I want to make this video talking about institutional adoption because institutional adoption is going to be one of the big factors that not only cements Bitcoin's position as an important and an extremely important asset in the global market for years to come, but also it's going to be one of the key factors that helps drive the Bitcoin price to $100,000 or more. There's a ton of money in these large institutions, and Bitcoin has been chipping away at the dams that hold that money in, but it hasn't quite broken through on all these layers. We see examples of institutions taking on Bitcoin and making it a part of their strategy by companies like MicroStrategy, even Tesla buying Bitcoin is an example. But you also see it in countries like El Salvador making it a legal tender. These are all large pools of money, but they're not like the massive pools of money out there. But I think a lot of headway has been made over the past few years. And these factors are things that these institutions are considering, they're looking at, and that you should know are important when thinking about or talking about institutional Bitcoin adoption. So let's hop into these 10 factors to consider. So, number one is volatility. So, Bitcoin is seen as a volatile asset. Regardless if that is true or not, there's a lot of people in the Bitcoin space that like to say it's not Bitcoin that's volatile, it's everyone else. Bitcoin is a stable standard of measure because we know it's fixed, right? It's not changing. Bitcoin isn't changing. They say TikTok next block. It's the same. There's 21 million coins. We know when they come out. That is true for Bitcoin. We know what the ledger is. We know how it runs. We know how it operates. Bitcoin isn't necessarily changing. It's everything else around it. People's perception of Bitcoin and their incorporation of Bitcoin that's changing, that's contributing to the volatility. And people are often say in the Bitcoin space that the volatility is a result of a lot of the changes made within the fiat system that is causing that volatility. But if you're an institution in the fiat system and you look at Bitcoin, and you see that the price was at $69,000 a few years ago, and now it's back under $30,000, you're gonna be like, that's big swings in price, and you see it moving up and down rapidly in one day. You're like, that's a lot, and it might trip some compliance measures for you to get involved with. So volatility is a key factor. And one note of hope here is that over time, and if you look at, and I should have the chart, I should have the projections, but there's a chart out there. If you look at Bitcoin's volatility over time, you actually see that it's going down over time. And this is a trend that we expect to continue. So as Bitcoin grows, as it gets more adoption, we expect the volatility of the asset and the asset class to go down over time. So that is a positive, and that, of course, over time, that will lead to having less volatility and more likely to be adopted. Which brings us to number two, regulation. And this is something that's been talked about nonstop over the past few years. Is it security? Is it a commodity? What is it? And this is something that we're not quite clear on, right? So lack of clear regulatory framework makes it hard for institutions to adopt Bitcoin because they need clear standards and clear rules to follow, especially with large amounts of money. They don't want to be on the wrong side of the law. Okay. They have whole teams, buildings of people in compliance, lawyers, accountants, all these type of people to make sure that they're in compliance and they're not messing up. You have to do that with a large scale institution. It's just the reality of their world. And until you have clear regulation on Bitcoin from governments on what it is, how will it be taxed? How will it be treated? Right? These larger institutions are going to avoid it because they can't add it to their portfolios because they have clauses and stuff in what they can invest in, and Bitcoin doesn't check all the right boxes. But we're making headway, and as Bitcoin grows, as it is around longer and longer, and more people are talking about it, and it's getting used more and more places, the regulatory clarity should become more clear, and you'll see more companies and institutions adopt that. Number three is custody. So Bitcoin is unique in that it's one of the only assets that you can truly own and you can truly self-custody. And it's extremely important. We saw the examples of if you let someone else hold your keys. Always remember, not your keys, not your Bitcoin. Institutions, they need robust insured custody solutions to ensure that their assets are secure. Okay. There's solutions out there, but I don't think we're quite far enough because it's just time hasn't passed long enough for there to be the right requirements for a lot of these custody providers. Now, they're out there. There's good ones out there. But for these larger institutions, it requires a lot of due diligence and a lot of questions and a lot of research to find a custody solution that works for them. Because the last thing they want is to drop a few $1 billion into Bitcoin and have it with a custodian, because you're not going to have the CEO of a company holding $10 billion worth of Bitcoin for the company. You're not going to have that. That'd be silly. Of course, that will inevitably happen, and there'll be news articles about that, about some CEO of some company holding all the private keys, and there'll be a lawsuit because they lose it or something happens. Like, that's inevitably going to happen, and it's going to be ridiculous, and we're all going to sit back and be like, oh my gosh. But custody solutions are critical, and so this is being developed as we speak. More and more custody providers are coming online, and they're educating more of these institutions on that. So we can expect to see institutional grade custodians become more and more prominent over the next few years and grow as institutions start moving into Bitcoin. But again, it's there, but not quite, right? It's almost there. And number 4 is insurance. So this is oftentimes related to custody. If there's a lack of insurance coverage, and I think this goes back to like regulation and regulatory clarity. If there's lack of clarity on the asset, it's hard to really insure the asset. And if the asset's seen as really risky, insurance can be expensive, right? How do you insure something like Bitcoin? What do you insure it with? So this is all stuff that's going to be ironed out in the future. But this is a key factor and key deciding factor for these institutions is, hey, can we insure the Bitcoin? What happens if at no fault of our own, the Bitcoin gets lost, something happens? That's a good question, right? Especially when it comes to hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. You got to know the answers to those, and it's got to be an adequate solution. You can't just be like, we'll figure it out. That works for you and I, the everyday person in general, but it doesn't work for these larger institutions. Number 4, tax treatment. This goes down into regulation, but the tax implications of holding crypto assets, they're trying to figure this out, right? I know they talk about Bitcoin and how it shows up on your balance sheet, and they talk about it being an indefinite intangible. So basically, if you buy it and the price gets marked down at any point in time, so if you bought it at $60,000, or you say you bought Bitcoin at $30,000, it went up to 60, but then went back down to 15, and then now back up at 30. So you're basically break even, but because it went down to 15, you have to mark it down to 15, and you can't mark it back up. So that messes with companies' balance sheets, that messes with taxes. So that needs to become more clear for institutions on how it's treated from a tax perspective. And I think it's out there. There's some clarity, but it's not quite concrete. It's not quite concrete because of regulations and all that kind of stuff. There's still like ways around it. And of course, this stuff will be firmed up in the years to come, at least I believe. Number 6 is negative perceptions. And this is a big one. So, I had a friend when I was doing consulting, one of my other consultants he'd always say perception is reality. And that's true. Bitcoin is still seen as risky. It's still seen as speculative. It's still seen as linked to criminal activity. It's still associated with crypto, right? As a whole, as a broader market. I was talking to a buddy who's very traditional in the sense of went to a good school, got a job at an institution, like just like the traditional path that you go down, and he's successful in that path. And he doesn't know much about Bitcoin. He doesn't have any Bitcoin, and he still associates it directly with crypto. That's for a lot of people out there. If you're in the space, you think it's mind blowing that someone would not understand what Bitcoin is, or that they would associate it with risky activities. Because we know the truth. Like it's the Bitcoin blockchain is truth, right? It's a incorruptible ledger. And as such, it's not really the best source to be doing criminal illicit activities because it can be traced and tracked. And it can't necessarily be hacked, but it can be traced and tracked. And so there's better options out there if you're going to indulge in illicit activities, maybe fiat cash. I'm not saying engage in illicit activities, but there's a certain type of fiat cash that is used for the most of illicit activities. Maybe you've seen Narcos when they were burying this stuff underground because they had too much of it. They couldn't deposit in banks. But anyways, Bitcoin still has negative perceptions, but that'll get more and more overcome with time, usage, and integration into the institutions and society as a whole. Number 7 is liquidity. A big factor that is keeping a lot of these large institutions out is the liquidity of the Bitcoin asset class. Right now, it's at 400 to 500 billion, and to us normal people, that seems like a lot of money. But to large institutions who have $1 trillion under management, that's not enough, right? There's not enough liquidity in the system for them to move funds in and out of Bitcoin without moving the market. And because of that, or without owning too large of a percent of the market, and because of that, they can't put money in, or they can't put the amount of money. So it doesn't even make sense for them to invest their money in something like Bitcoin because they're like, I have 10 billion or I have $100 billion and I could put $1 billion in, maybe minimum, and maybe be okay. I got to deal with all the stuff that comes with that. It's too much of a headache, right? They don't have the ease and efficiency of moving money in and out of Bitcoin the way they want to because of the liquidity. And I was listening to a guy named Greg Foss talk about what that liquidity really needs to be. And he gave a number around $4 trillion. So Bitcoin's market cap needs to be around $4 trillion for these large institutions to really see that they can start moving money in and out and it not being necessarily impacted by the market not being impacted by their trades, the size of trades that they want to make. And that makes about sense. And so at 500, or I like to say every $1 trillion, and it's roughly every $1 trillion, Bitcoin is $50,000. So at $1 trillion, Bitcoin's 50,000. At $2 trillion, it's 100,000. At 3 trillion, it's 150. And at 4 trillion, it's $200,000. So Bitcoin would roughly be around $200,000 when these big institutions really start putting money in there. And if that happens, or when that happens, you could see a massive, potentially, of course, not financial advice, price increase, because we know that there's a limited supply of Bitcoin. And that money, if it's going to buy Bitcoin, it's going to be interesting. It's going to be really interesting to happen. But as of right now, the liquidity isn't there. But over this next cycle, it could get there. But definitely over the next 2 cycles, I would definitely expect it to get to that level and beyond. Number 8 is understanding. So this goes back to my friend that I was talking about. He's successful in his career, but he doesn't understand Bitcoin. Same thing with a lot of his institutional decision makers, CEOs, shareholders. They're focused on running their organizations, right? They're focused on running their businesses. And if their businesses have been doing well, they've been working, like that's what they're going to focus on. They're not going to go out like focusing on Bitcoin. Okay. They're focused on just getting returns for their shareholders. If you listen to the MicroStrategy story with Michael Saylor, obviously a smaller institution, but he talks about they were in a problem. MicroStrategy was facing a really big dilemma, one that could have potentially destroyed the company or completely changed the company for the worse. Required a sale, required just, and that was the position that Michael Saylor was in. And so he had to find solutions. And typically it takes a big catalyst event. I've talked about this on my podcast before, a big catalyst for something to happen for people to change their mindset on what they do or what solutions they're looking for. Not every institution in the country has had that catalyst happen, has had that big event where they need to change their mindset, change their perception, and start looking at new solutions they might not have thought about before, which would include Bitcoin. A lot of them have heard about Bitcoin. It's been brought up, but they haven't needed to go after it. The need hasn't been there. And unfortunately, I think that will have to happen for a lot of these big time decision makers to really get on board with Bitcoin, to really start bringing it to the table as something serious for their company to invest in. And I think that'll happen either with some big economic turbulence. And so, more and more companies like MicroStrategy going through a similar situation, just disruption, causing them to pivot, or just time. And then the decision makers now age out and the new decision makers are more Bitcoin friendly or more Bitcoin familiar. And so it makes more sense. So I think those type of factors will play on each other to increase that understanding. And then the final thing is just videos like this, people talking about this, about Bitcoin and stuff like that. I'm talking about it. None of my relatives are heads of organizations, but I guarantee I have a friend that maybe will stumble across one of my videos whose dad is a CEO of some company. And maybe then the friend watches one of my videos and his dad hears about it. The friend sends the video to his dad or they bring it up in conversation. And next thing you know, the dad's getting educated on something like Bitcoin, or the mom, it could be mom, doesn't matter what the gender of the person is, could be getting educated on Bitcoin. And then now the education is getting into those conversations at the highest levels of these organizations. So just education, content, videos, and stuff like this will help pave the way. Even the small things, you don't know who's listening, you don't know who's watching, and you don't know who they know, and you don't know what problems they're dealing with, that perhaps you're laying out a solution for those problems when you're making those videos, when you're educating. So keep on educating out there if you're listening. And that's a good time to plug my book right here, The Bitcoin Business Accelerator. So this book teaches you how to start and grow your own Bitcoin consulting business. Even if you have never bought Bitcoin before, I show you how to do that and how to teach people about Bitcoin, because I believe that education is key and it's going to be one of the fundamental drivers of adoption over the next few years. And I think more and more people that are getting involved need to be educated and need to have a close connection to someone they can trust that can help guide them in this space, because I've seen too many examples of people not having that and losing their funds, losing their Bitcoin, getting distracted, right, making poor decisions. And so I don't want that to happen. So if you want to copy this book, you can check the links below. You can get it on Amazon. Just Google Bitcoin Business Accelerator and get your copy of the book and start your educational journey there. That is understanding. Number 9 is ESG concerns. And these concerns are out there because ESG is still a big movement. It's still a big push. And I think it's like energy, sustainability, and governance. And there's been a push to give companies and industries ESG scores on how they comply with things. And Bitcoin is seen as this thing that is destroying the planet with all the miners and all that kind of stuff. Now, if you spend more than 10 minutes with an open mind doing research on Bitcoin mining, you will find that most of the claims that are made by mainstream media sources about how Bitcoin is going to destroy the planet are just outright false. If you go back and look throughout history, there are claims made 5, 6, 7 years ago that said if Bitcoin continues, it will use up all the energy on the planet. Here we are. I'm making a video. I got a light on in front of me. I got a light on behind me. I got my computer here. I'm using energy. Bitcoin hasn't used up all the energy, right? So there's been these claims that have been continuously debunked, not only by facts at the time, but also just by time playing out and showing those claims were not true. They're just ridiculous. And so that's playing out in the space. But the good thing is there's a ton of information out there to counter a lot of these claims saying that Bitcoin is a disaster for the planet, but that perception still exists. And going back to those institutional leaders, when that perception's out there, they got to understand that perception is reality, and that if their shareholders are not fully educated on Bitcoin and that it is a positive for the planet, a positive for the environment, if they're not educated on that yet, that it could be a disastrous move to incorporate Bitcoin for their shareholder returns, because the shareholders are going to get mad thinking that they're destroying the planet and stupid for incorporating Bitcoin. But that's not the case, but it's just a lack of education and understanding. So that's something that these institutions do consider and are considering. But over time, again, with education, I think that those concerns will fade away. And I think we'll see that Bitcoin is one of the most positive forces for the environment and for sustainability. I truly believe that. And I think it's really cool when we go down that rabbit hole. Maybe I'll make another video on that. But that leads us to the final one. Number 10 is competing assets. And so this is a key one because I've mentioned before is bringing Bitcoin to the table for conversations about investing your capital. And Bitcoin is in more of those conversations today than it was 5 years ago. It's in more of those conversations today than it was 10 years ago. And it will be in more of those conversations tomorrow, next year, 5 years from now, than it is now. And that's a great thing. But they're still competing assets. And you still have to realize that the fiat system is just orders of magnitude bigger than the Bitcoin system. Okay, there are traditions, there are standards, there are just like ways of thinking that exist in the fiat system that aren't going to go away overnight. Okay, there are still people that put a bunch of their money into gold, and we haven't seen gold do much. And I think gold, it has a time and place, and there's value there, but they would choose gold over Bitcoin. There's people that would choose meme coins over Bitcoin. So there's other assets that are competing for the capital. And I think the critical thing is, one, is understanding what Bitcoin is, what it is and where it's going, and then adequately categorizing what type of capital you have that you can allocate to you can allocate to Bitcoin in that situation. I think that's really important. And these institutions, right, they're starting to figure this out, or they're starting to learn. I think over the past few years, when we saw examples of the traditional, like it was 60-40 portfolio not working, where bonds were just a total waste of money, seeing a lot of the traditional solutions not really perform very well, I think is that catalyst event that makes these institutions question where they're allocating their capital and are there better places to put their capital. Just on a geopolitical global scale, when the U.S. froze the Russian assets because they were holding it in treasuries of sorts, right? When they weaponized the financial system against their enemies, these countries now saw that holding U.S. treasuries, holding assets in the United States, isn't as neutral as they thought it was. There's more risk there. Okay, and when that happens, the smart country, the smart leader is going to be like, now U.S. assets, holding assets for our portfolio, while they're high quality assets, have more risk, because if a time comes that we're on the wrong side of Uncle Sam, or we need to get the assets out and something's going on, like we may not be able to. So now they have to start questioning how they're allocating their capital. Now, this doesn't mean they're going to take all of their money out of the U.S. treasuries or all their money out of those type of assets. It just means that they have to start considering other sources, potentially other sources that are unbiased, non-political, apolitical, that are universal, that anyone can get access to. Things like Bitcoin are going to be in those conversations and in those considerations for that capital. And I think that's going to happen more and more over time, especially as we see more and more of this turbulence of this wild fiat system we have going on. So anyways, those are the 10 things, the 10 factors these institutions are considering. So let me just wrap this up with a quick summary so you know all 10, and then you can think about these as you have this conversation, or you can look at institutions, or if you're an institutional investor, or if you are CEO of an institution, you're watching this, let me know what you think. But anyways, number 1 is volatility, 2 is regulation, 3 is custody, 4 is insurance, 5 is tax treatment, 6 is negative perceptions about Bitcoin, 7 is liquidity, 8 is more understanding, more education, 9 is ESG concerns, and 10, there's other competing assets. So once those things are addressed and any concerns are overcome, I think we'll see a flood of money going into Bitcoin from institutional investors, from large institutions. And I think this will help not only solidify Bitcoin's importance in our global economy and your personal life for years to come, but it'll also drive up the price of Bitcoin, giving you much more purchasing power. So, not financial advice, but it might be wise to get some Bitcoin just in case it catches on. That's it for this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And of course, if you need help, I have links below. Get your copy of the Bitcoin Business Accelerator by clicking one of the links below. You can get a free copy, a free PDF copy, or you can buy it on Amazon. And that's it for this video. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.